Ladies and gentlemen, I am very happy. It's a great pleasure to welcome you tonight in the National Liberal Club to a lecture by a very prominent scholar and journalist by Timothy Garton Ash. And Timothy, I would never have imagined that I will have the honor to introduce you to an audience in front of a painting with the famous former liberal British Prime Minister Gladstone from the 19th century, and that as a German. It's a massive pleasure and honor to do this. Welcome, Timothy. Before we start with the program of tonight, let me first make an organizational remark and ask you, if you have mobile phones with you, to turn the mobile phones off, because we are not alone. The lecture and the discussion will be streamed. So I also welcome those on the streaming to join us in the next hour. And before we start with the lecture and the discussion, we have two further very brief words of welcome. The first word of welcome will be by Karin Rehacek. I use the German pronunciation of your name, who runs this wonderful place which spreads the atmosphere of the great history of liberalism in Britain. And then after her, my friend Henrik Bach-Mortensen will actually read a short welcome message by our president, the president of Liberal International. Liberal International organizes this night. Hakima El-Haiti, who unfortunately cannot be here tonight. The reason is very plain. She didn't get the visa, her visa on time by the UK government, may be a late consequence of Brexit. So please, the floor is yours.
Good evening, and thank you very much indeed for the warm welcome. It's very rare that I have my name as my surname pronounced correctly, so I'm hugely grateful for that. So a very warm welcome from myself. I'm Karl-Heinz Paque, Chair of the National Liberal Club. My welcome is to everyone here in the room and also on the streaming. The National Liberal Club, we have over 2,400 members. We have over 50 clubs, circles and forums. These range from sports, the arts and culture, debate and discussion, and we have new ones joining us all the time. This is a members club run by members for members, so all of our clubs, circles and forums are chaired by our membership. We've recently launched the Opera Circle, where we had our inaugural event around 10 days ago. We have over 370 reciprocal clubs around the world, so if you find yourself in Punta Rena, if you find yourself in Anchorage, in Paris, Tasmania, there is a home from home for you. There are many benefits of membership. To have a London base, to have the reciprocal club, whether you're in London or whether you are based overseas, our fantastic curated programme of events, networking, our dining, our terrace, our bar, and events such as these that we're running in conjunction with Liberal International. Our membership fees for overseas members is the first year the full town rate, and thereafter it is discounted down by 75% for 2 years and then down to 25%. I am around for the rest of the evening, so if you do have any questions, please do come to see me. Otherwise, please visit our website, www.nlc.org.uk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, Henrik.
It's an honor for me to speak on behalf of our president, Hakima El-Haiti. Dear Professor Garton Ash, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guest of Liberal International. And Hakima says, "It's with deep regret that I cannot be with you today in person to welcome our distinguished speaker. The challenges related to migration and travel restrictions are intensifying, making even obtaining a visa more complex, even for a president of Liberal International. The world is evolving and becoming more rigid, with barriers to people's movements strengthening for various reasons, which you will discuss among many other important topics during the Isaiah Berlin lecture. Today we find ourselves at a critical juncture in Europe's history, grappling with a myriad of challenges that demand our collective attention and action. The European project, born from the ashes of the conflict, now stands at a crossroads, facing pressing issues that require our unwavering commitments. War threatens the stability that those in Europe hold dear, those beyond Europe seek to emulate. As conflict persists on the borders of Europe and tensions simmer within, we liberals share a growing concern for the creeping normalcy of disaster and political division. Indeed, our concern is that we no longer talk of the rise of the populist movements as we did a decade ago, but now seek solutions for loosening their grip on power in many countries across the continent. In the face of such division and exclusion, we must embrace new means and methods to rebuild unity and solidarity, principles that have long defined Europe. In addition to these internal challenges, Europe must realize its obligations to urgently address transcontinental threats, including the global crisis of climate change. The need for bold and decisive action to protect our planet and future generations has never been more apparent. As we navigate a new era marked by rapid technological advancements and shifting geopolitical dynamics, it is imperative that Europe evolves to meet the demands of the times. By embracing innovation, fostering cooperation, and championing progressive values, we must pave the way for a brighter and more sustainable future. Although the world presents us with numerous concerns, Europe has demonstrated resilience in the face of adversity. Recent times have shown that European institutions can effectively tackle challenges and risks, such as the joint procurement of vaccines and the creation of mutual debt to address the pandemic's impact. However, clouds loom on the horizon, stemming from internal political dynamics, geopolitical shifts, and economic challenges. It is crucial that Europe prepares to navigate these complex issues with resolve and determination. To make it short, as an Italian leader used to say, we must combine the pessimism of the intelligence with the optimism of the will. Only by understanding the challenges ahead can we hope to overcome them. And tonight we have the privilege of welcoming Timothy Ash and hearing from him about the challenges ahead, as well as the opportunities for Europe to build a resilient, inclusive, and forward-looking continent. As liberals broadly and Liberal International specifically, we are committed to constructing bridges of tolerance and peace and to upholding Europe's legacy as a beacon of hope and progress for generations to come. This was the greeting from our president. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I give the floor to Timothy Garton Ash, let me say 2 sentences on the Isaiah Berlin lecture. This lecture, organized by Liberal International, is roughly 25 years old, and it is, for us, a very important event where we discuss liberal identity and where we discuss liberal thought leadership. Isaiah Berlin himself was one of the really giant figures in this respect. That we invited Timothy Garton Ash, and thanks again, Timothy, that you accepted the invitation, has, of course, good reasons. Timothy Garton Ash is what I would call an unusual personality. He is one, in my view, one of the greatest analysts of political Europe over the last 50 years. And note, I'm talking of continental Europe in particular, not only, but continental Europe, and that as a British citizen who grew up in London. He was witness of the bleak conditions of communist Central Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany from the late 1970s on. He was witness of the Solidarność movement in Poland and the Charta 77 in Prague. He was witness of the fall of the Iron Curtain. He witnessed the transformation, the difficult transformation of these countries and regions in the 1990s. And he was and is witness of the rise of what may be called Putinism. He summarized these experiences in a wonderful book, Homelands, it's called, which has been translated into 20 languages. And the 5 chapters in this book wonderfully summarize the development of Europe in the post-war period. The first chapter, Destroyed, 1945. The second chapter, Divided, 1961 to 1979. The third chapter, Rising, 1980 to 1989. The fourth chapter, Triumphing, 1990 up to 2007. And the last chapter, Faltering, from 2008 to 2022. And this is exactly what we are going to talk about today. As you all know, TGA, as he is called in brief language, TGA is professor at Oxford University, a columnist of The Guardian, and for us liberals, he is also a great guardian of the heritage of Ralph Dahrendorf. Ralph Dahrendorf, one of the greatest liberal intellectuals that we have in our family, in our movement. By the way, he was president of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in the 1980s. I'm extremely proud of being a sort of follower of him, a humble follower. And of course, a German and British intellectual of first rate, president of the London School of Economics, and later at St. Anthony's College in Oxford, where he worked together with Timothy Garton Ash. So you see, we have every reason to be proud to have with us tonight Timothy Garton Ash. Please, Timothy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Karl-Heinz, for this really very kind introduction. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here in this temple of Gladstonian liberalism. I belong to no political party, but I'm a lifelong liberal and see myself very much in that tradition. And when I say, ich bin ein Berliner, I refer not just to the city, which means so much in my life, but to the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, who I had the great privilege to know and who was a great English and European liberal. And our subjects tonight, Europe and freedom, were 2 subjects about which he cared a great deal and which have been leitmotifs of my own life, as I explain in the book. If we think about Europe and freedom. The last 50 years, 50 and a bit years, half century, have, in my view, a rather clear shape. When I started traveling to continental Europe, Karl-Heinz, because of course we're in Europe here, let's make no mistake, as we are in Oxford, in 1972, Europe was still a continent of dictators. We forget that. We did the numbers for this book. 289 million Europeans were living in democracies, 389 million in dictatorships. Not just the entirety of Eastern and Southeastern Europe and the Soviet Union, but of course Spain, Greece, and Portugal under extreme right-wing or fascist dictatorships. Across the next, roughly speaking, 35 years until about 2007, you have, painting with a broad brush, a remarkable spread of freedom, of democracy, and of the core institutions of the geopolitical West in Europe. Think about it, 1972, just 6 members of the European Economic Community as it was then, and just 15 of NATO. By 2007, 27 members of the European Union as it has become, and 26 of NATO. An extraordinary, unprecedented enlargement, by the way, including the Baltic states, which in 1989 still did not exist formally on most political maps of Europe, although they always existed in the hearts and minds of their own peoples. Of course, this period was not one of a continuous upward curve. That's not how history works. There were major setbacks. There was the declaration of a state of war, stan wojenny, in Poland in 1981. There were 5 terrible wars in former Yugoslavia. And of course, there was 9/11. But one of the interesting things I found when working on this book is that 9/11, while it clearly was a major turning point in Middle Eastern history and in US history, was not, with benefit of hindsight, the great turning point in European history. The great turning point in European history was 2008. The near simultaneous eruption of the global financial crisis and Vladimir Putin's seizure of 2 large chunks of Georgia, about 20% of the sovereign territory of Georgia in 2008, started a cascade of crises which continues all the way down to the 24th of February 2022, Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which closes what I call the post-wall era, the era that began with the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989. The global financial crisis segues into the Great Recession in many of our countries, and of course the Eurozone crisis, under which Southern Europe suffered so much for many years. 2010 already, Viktor Orban, that great young hero of 1989, I remember him well from those times, 2010 already started the demolition of democracy in Hungary. So much so that today you have a full member state of the EU that is no longer a democracy. It's what political scientists call a competitive authoritarian system. 2014, of course, Putin's seizure of Crimea, and as Ukrainians always remind us, the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian war, which didn't just begin in 2022 and has now been going on for 10 years. 2015, the refugee crisis, 2016, Brexit, the election of Trump, great successes for populists in France, Marine Le Pen, in Germany, the AfD, and the 2017 elections, COVID, and all the way down to the beginning of the largest war in Europe since 1945, which continues to this day. So if you want a high point of the quest for Europe whole and free, to use the great phrase of President George H.W. Bush delivered in Mainz in 1989, arguably it was somewhere around 2007, because since that time we have seen a clear regression in many respects, including, if I may say so, the really shaming fact that it's difficult for the president of the Liberal International to get a visa to come to Britain. But still, Europe is one of the largest concatenations of the free and relatively rich in today's world. If you look at Freedom House's 2023 report on freedom in the world, we can argue about their definitions of free countries, partly free countries, but nonetheless, 34 out of 84 free countries by their definition are in Europe. Now, many of those countries are rather small, so it's only 7% of the world's population, but many of them are also quite rich, so it's 17% of the world's GDP. So there's still an awful lot to defend in this Europe of ours. But I want, for the larger part of my lecture, to address the question of why, having done so well for so long across these 35 ascending years, we had this downward turn, we've had this cascade of crises. Because I think when we address that question, it actually brings us to the question, what is to be done now? And I'm going to look at three, I mean, there are many, many, many topics one could cover. I'm just going to pick out, for reasons of time, three lessons of history, mistakes that I think we made, which have lessons for us today. The first is, to put it most simply, the fallacy of extrapolation. Broadly speaking, we took the way history had been going for so long, and particularly since 1989, and kidded ourselves that it was just going to go on going that way. As Thomas Bagger, a wonderful German intellectual diplomat, puts it, we took the most non-linear event in modern European history, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, and turned it into a linear projection. Or to state this in the most general terms, we confuse history with a small h with history with a large H. By the way, I'm afraid you can't do that in German because all nouns have initial capital letters, but the thought is there nonetheless. History with a small h, history as it rarely happens, always the product of the interaction between deep structure and process on the one hand, and conjuncture, chance, collective will, and individual leadership on the other. That's how history rarely happens. That's how 1989 happened. 1989 was actually a 1 in a million chance example of historical luck, what Machiavelli called fortuna. And we turned it into history with a capital H, an inevitable process of the expansion of freedom. The neo-Hegelian idea that Francis Fukuyama explored in his book, The End of History, although the illusions, I want to insist, didn't come so much in the early 1990s, when actually those of you who were around will remember we were very uncertain of the way things were going. They came in the early to mid 2000s when everything seemed to have gone so well. But history is not a process. Freedom is not a process. Freedom is always a struggle. This is what the Ukrainians are reminding us of today. For me, the word of the decade is the Ukrainian word volia. And volia is a really interesting word because it combines the meanings in one word of freedom and the will to fight for it. It contains the root will. By the way, in the Ukrainian version, not the Russian version of the same word. Interesting semantic detail. And volia is what we need even in the most established Western liberal democracies. Freedom always has to be fought for. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. So that's lesson number one for now. Not a process, no automaticity. It always has to be fought for. Lesson number two, if you look back to those times, early to mid-2000s, there were just multiple examples of hubris. Of course, the hubris of the United States marching into Iraq and believing that if you toppled the dictator, somehow a democracy would automatically emerge from below. By the way, an illusion fed by what had happened in 1989. The illusions of Tony Blair's Cool Britannia, believing that you could just go on opening your culture, opening your markets, opening your borders, and there wouldn't at some point be a reaction against it. The hubris of the European Union itself, which at this time liked to speak as if it had found a model of post-national or transnational governance, which the rest of the world had simply graciously to follow. I could go on with the listings of hubris, but I'm going to focus on one. The hubris of a globalized, financialized capitalism. Now, I formulate that very carefully. Not the loose formulation neoliberalism. Globalized, financialized capitalism. Because as the wonderful German historian Jürgen Kocher points out, it's a combination of these two things, globalization and financialization, which have given us the problems we have. One on its own or the other on its own might not have. It's a combination of the two. And it's globalized, financialized capitalism, which in large measure led us into the global financial crisis, starting in 2008, which had such dire and long-term consequences, and which also has given us levels of inequality not seen for 100 years. Vertically, socioeconomically, rich and poor, horizontally, between different areas of our own countries, and globally, in all three dimensions. According to a very careful study of world inequality edited by F. Alvarado, published by CUP, between 1980 and 2018, the top 1% took a larger share of global growth, twice the share of global growth, than the bottom 50%. Right? And as Thomas Piketty points out in his excellent latest book, one of the effects of this has been, and here I'm trespassing on Karl-Heinz territory as an economist, but I think the statement holds, that it is extremely difficult to tax effectively the very rich, the billionaires, or global multinational companies. And that has major impacts on our own society, including, as Piketty writes, a feeling of anger and resentment at this perceived inequality. So we thought at the time that globalization would give global aggregate gains. It did. It benefited hundreds of millions of people in countries like China and India. But we also thought, and this was a mistake, that those global aggregate gains would not just justify, argue about that, but compensate for specific local losses. Populism told us something very different. If you feel hard done by in the post-industrial north of England, or the southeast of Poland, or northeastern France, or wherever it might be, it doesn't make it any better for you that globalization has helped hundreds of millions of people in China and India. And it wasn't just economic inequality. In the same period, we were getting more what I would call cultural inequality, the inequality of attention and respect. That is to say, people in the poorer parts of our countries, people often without higher education, felt that they were simply not being seen by cosmopolitan, liberal, metropolitan elites in clubs like, dare I say, the National Liberal Club, or other more hip venues even, and of course by the media and by people in universities. They were simply not seen. They were ignored and they were disrespected. And the combination of the economic inequality and the cultural inequality has given us a wave of anti-liberal populism, which draws upon and is still drawing upon deep aquifers of resentment and anger, deep, deep wells of resentment, not yet exhausted. And therefore, we as liberals, with a small l, I'm using the term with a small l, implying the broader family, need to pay attention to equality, and by the way, also to sovereignty. Because one of the problems of not being able to tax the billionaires and global multinational companies is actually the problem of sovereignty. Who is the sovereign for Facebook? Who is the sovereign for a billionaire? Now, this for me is both a normative and a practical point. There are many varieties of liberalism, as you all know. Many of them represented by different parties in the Liberal International. It's quite a broad church. My kind of liberalism is the egalitarian liberalism of Ralph Dahrendorf and Ronald Dworkin. So what Dahrendorf argued actually in a lecture, if memory serves, to the Liberal International, is that liberty requires what he called a common floor, a common starting point of housing, of healthcare, of education, and he emphasized of meaningful work for all. And it's on that basis that you have a genuinely liberal society. Ronnie Dworkin put as his central principle of his kind of liberalism that there should be, I quote, equal respect and concern for each citizen or for each member of the society. So that's a normative statement, right? A statement of principle about liberalism. You can agree with that or disagree. But even if you disagree with that, you must agree with the practical political point that if we're going to address this wave of anti-liberal populism in Europe, in the West, and globally, we have to do something about these levels of economic and cultural inequality. So that's my second point. How we do that is, of course, a complicated and difficult question to which I have no ready answers, but I just want to emphasize what the challenge is and just how important it is. My final lesson of history, which leads to what is to be done, is this. The German historian Reinhard Koselleck has a wonderful essay entitled The Unknown Future and the Art of Prognosis. And Koselleck makes a very simple but very powerful point, which is that the more often a phenomenon occurs in history, the more likely we are to be able to make probabilistic statements when that phenomenon recurs. So I think we can make the statement, we shall all die, with a reasonably high level of probability, because in rather a large historical data set, there's no known example to the contrary, at least known to me. Wars, revolutions, what happens to people when they stay too long in power? These are recurring phenomena where we have so many examples from history that when it recurs again, you can say, aha, I think we can make an intelligent guess, not a prediction, but an intelligent guess about how things might develop. Now, one such phenomenon is declining empires. Let me tell you something about declining empires. They don't like it. Ask the British. The liberal imperialists, many of whom enjoy themselves in this club. Ask the French. Ask the Portuguese, who were fighting to defend their colonies in Angola and Mozambique until the early 1970s, until the end of the dictatorship, the revolution of the carnations, which we, the 40th and the 50th anniversary, which we just celebrated. Empires fight back. So when the largest remaining empire in Europe, the Soviet Russian Empire, softly and suddenly vanished away with hardly a shot fired in anger, but in just 3 years, between 1989 and 1991, we should not have assumed that was the end of the story. We were not wrong. We were not wrong to try very hard, as we did, to build a partnership for modernization and democratization in Russia in the 1990s. That was not a mistake. But when the empire started striking back, you could argue in Chechnya, but most clearly 2008 Georgia, and then unambiguously 2014 Crimea and the beginning of the war in eastern Ukraine. Then, informed by history, we should have said, yeah, we know, we understand, we know what's going on. That's what declining empires do. They strike back. And I would argue that if we had adjusted our policy much more fundamentally after 2014, reduced our energy dependency on Russia instead of increasing it, gone after the dirty money swirling around the city, also known as Londongrad, and many other cities in Europe, armed the Ukrainians much more effectively, sent a much clearer and stronger message to Putin and to his potential allies of the cost, we might not be in the mess we are today. I'm not going to say we would not have been, but we might not have been. But we failed to learn that lesson of history until 2022. Now, what follows from that, in my view, is that we need a clear, sighted strategic commitment, not just not to allow Ukraine to lose, but to enable Ukraine to win this war against Russia. That is not only the best thing for Ukraine, because that's the only way in which it can truly become a flourishing, democratic, sovereign European country. It's also, in the longer term, the best thing for Russia. Not in the shorter term, perhaps, but in the longer term. It's a hard truth, but it's the truth that actually Richard von Weizsäcker spelled out to Germany in his famous speech in 1985, when he said, basically, dear compatriots, guys, the best thing that happened to us was defeat. All our successes, our freedoms, our democracy, our prosperity have been built on defeat. Now, obviously, it is not possible, faced with a nuclear-armed power like Russia, to have total defeat in that sense. That's self-evidently not possible. But I would argue that the maximum feasible defeat, we could argue about what that is, history will tell, is also the best thing longer term for Russia. Zbigniew Brzezinski used to say, with Ukraine, Russia is still an empire. Without Ukraine, Russia has to start trying to be a more normal nation state. And fundamentally, I think that's right. Now, losing an empire and finding a role can take quite a long time. Ask the British. Dean Acheson said that about us in the early 1960s, and some would argue we're still trying. But it's a start. And finally, in the eyes of the rest of the world, and some of the opinion polling, global opinion polling that my Oxford research project did with the European Council on Foreign Relations last autumn demonstrated this, our credibility is at stake. In that polling, either majorities or pluralities in countries like China and India said that Russia is at war with the West. Not with Ukraine, with us, with the West. They think Russia is likely to win in the next 5 years. And then quite shockingly, majorities or pluralities in many of these countries say the EU is likely to fall apart within the next 20 years. And what is more, when you look in detail at the data, those who say Russia is likely to win and those who say the EU is likely to fall apart are quite closely correlated. They overlap. So make no mistake, our Western and European credibility is at stake in this struggle. And then, of course, we have the challenges of European defense, especially if Donald Trump is re-elected US president on Guy Fawkes Day, suitably enough, the 5th of November, and the tasks of EU and NATO enlargement. So those are my 3 lessons of history, which have to-do notes at the bottom of them. Let me conclude by saying this. Contrary, if you'll allow me to say so, to what was tweeted by the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in German, my title today is not the rise and fall of a free Europe. It's the rise and faltering of a free Europe. Somebody at the Naumann Foundation, dear Karl-Heinz, translated this as Aufstieg und Scheitern, the rise and failure of free Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, free Europe has definitely not failed or fallen. As I said at the beginning, most of Europe is still largely free. We still have the best Europe we've ever had. Slightly less so than 2007, but still the best Europe in historical perspective that we have ever had. And there is absolutely nothing inevitable. That is the point about the small h versus large h history. Nothing inevitable about what happens next. The mistake we made then was to believe that a continued ascent was inevitable. Let's not make the mistake now of believing that a continued descent is inevitable. It's not inevitable, it's up to us. And liberals in the broadest sense should be in the front line of defending a free Europe. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So I will immediately, when I come home, check who made this translation error. Faltering is not failing. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have another, let's say, maximum of 20 minutes to go. This is why I immediately open the floor to for your questions, your comments. Please tell us your name and your affiliation, and ask questions, make comments. I just start with one opening question. The 2 inequalities that you described as a major point of the polarization of our societies, the one is an economic one, where you may discuss measures of redistribution or whatever. You can do something tangible against it. And you can, of course, discuss whether it's the right diagnosis. But the other point, the polarization in cultural matters, is a much more difficult thing to counter. What would you recommend? What can our societies do? Even we liberals, in a streak of self-irony, you mentioned the wonderful ambiente here, and of course, we are many educated urban people in the liberal movement. I would like to know from you, what can we do to close the gap?
So it's a great question. In Arthur Miller's play, Death of a Salesman, the wife of the miserable and failing salesman says at some point, attention must be paid. She says, attention must be paid. And that's, I think, is the start of the answer, Karl-Heinz. Attention must be paid. Because the truth is that if you read the New York Times or the Guardian or the Süddeutsche or Le Monde, there was very, very little reporting about the poorer parts of our countries, about people in the post-industrial north or in small towns, until the populist wave. There was lots of reporting about the rest of the world, and certainly very little reporting done with imaginative sympathy. Because for me, one of the very important parts of liberalism is the liberal imagination. What you find in a novelist like Charles Dickens, the ability to think what it must be like to be really poor, or to be forced into a life of crime, or to be an illegal migrant. That imaginative sympathy, which was so lacking. So I think in media and scholarship and culture, that's one part of the answer. The other part, or another part, is this. As you will vividly recall, one of the great liberal projects of the second half of the 20th century was the expansion of higher education. Yeah? Mm. Bildung ist Bürgerrecht, said Ralph Dahrendorf.
Exactly.
Education is a civil right. Tony Blair, we must have 50% of our population, of our kids, going to university. We did. And what was the result? The unintended consequence was we split our societies down the middle, 50-50, between those who went to universities, spoke languages, loved traveling, liked Europe, lived in big cities, and those who didn't. So working out ways we can do in education and in working life and in communal life and civic life for that other half of our societies seems to me another very important part of the answer.
Thank you very much. Irina.
Thank you very much, Timothy. My name is Irina von Wiese. I am chair of the
Just a second.
Yes, sorry.
I can shout.
Of course, I forgot to mention we have to use micros, otherwise our streaming friends will not get us.
Irina von Wiese, I am the chair of Liberal International British Group, former member of the European Parliament, and as my name suggests, I'm a Brit with both German and Russian roots. And thank you very much for really engaging talk. My question is about another potentially declining empire, which you only mentioned tangentially in your talk on that, is the United States. And it seems to me that the Western Europe has relied on the US support, both financially, obviously in terms of defense and NATO Article 5 promise, for a long time, with the prospect of Trump potentially returning to the White House and potentially losing that support to some degree. Where does Europe stand, and are we sufficiently equipped to make Ukraine win, even if we do no longer have that support?
Thank you, Irina. Just pass on the mic to Graham. We collect.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim, for a fascinating lecture. I'm also another former MEP and the convener of Liberal International Scotland. And I want to ask you about something that happened towards the end of the Cold War. You used the phrase the liberal imagination. Towards the end of the Cold War in Germany, Willy Brandt and particularly Hans-Dietrich Genscher decided that the American-British idea that we should set up Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe and encourage those under Soviet domination to rise up against their oppressors and the sending of spies through Vienna was not perhaps the most intelligent way to go about things. And they started Ostpolitik through the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe and argued, perhaps were proven right, that by talking to the oppressors, we would actually expose the contradictions in their society and bring their societies crumbling down. Were they wrong?
Thank you for two excellent questions. US declining empire? Question mark. Look at the US economy. Seems to be doing pretty well compared with ours. But what I think we can say is probably withdrawing empire, which is something slightly different. And honestly, this year I will be on the 6th of June, I will be in Normandy because it's the 80th anniversary of D-Day. 80 years on from the beginning of liberation of Western Europe. Should we really be depending so much on the United States? It pains me greatly to say this, but Donald Trump had a point when he said Europeans should be spending more on their defense. So, I mean, let's hope it's not Trump, but if it is Trump, the question is which Trump? Extreme Trump, very extreme Trump, or pardon my French, batshit crazy Trump. Those are the options. So extreme Trump might do what the Heritage Foundation's plan for his presidency says, which is rapidly draw down the US conventional presence in Europe, but keep the nuclear umbrella, right? Now, in that circumstance, if we start now, and we're not doing enough now, building up our defense industry, building up our conventional capacity, well, some of us are, some of us aren't, I think we can certainly secure the defense of the NATO territory. I think we can secure the defense of what Ukraine currently controls. One has, in all honesty, to say it becomes more difficult to recover territory, for Ukraine to recover territory. And I say that with great pain because let's not kid ourselves. If the territorial division remains what it is now, with Russia occupying a territory, roughly 1/5 of the country, right? A territory the size of Portugal and half of Slovenia. That's a defeat. That's a defeat for Ukraine and that's a defeat for us. Let's not kid ourselves. So I hope very much it'll be another outcome and we will be able to do more for Ukraine. But that I think is a sadly realistic answer. Now, Graham, to your question, I think Radio Free Europe did a fantastic job. Wolna Europa, Freies Europa, wherever one went in Eastern Europe, people absolutely loved it. I think it was really important. They made a big mistake in 1956 in relation to Hungary, when the Hungarian service specifically called on Hungarians to rise, giving them the impression that the West would come to their aid. But they didn't make that mistake in 68 or 80, 81. But it needed the détente as well. It's always the two tracks, right? It's the containment, it's a powerful messaging, we're with you, we support you, but it's also the constructive engagement. And so for me, that's the lesson for our engagement with China now, most importantly. And I would say for our engagement with a post-Putin Russia. It's very difficult to see how you do it with Russia as it is today, but what I would just add one last thing. There are now millions of Russians outside Russia, in our countries and elsewhere, Georgia and elsewhere, and they are the most anti-Putin, pro-Navalny Russians, and we should do much more to support with them and communicate with them.
Please.
Hello, my name is Sean O'Kearney. I'm Sec-Gen of the Liberal Group in the European Committee of the Regions, which is the EU body that represents subnational government. We're in the temple of Gladstonian liberalism, and just a few yards up the street, there's another great British intellectual who's not often considered a political scientist, but I'm referring to Isaac Newton, who's buried not that far away from here. But myself, having studied physics just up the road at UCL many years ago, and then politics at Berkeley College just up the road, I've always been fascinated by Isaac Newton's third law of motion, which says every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Because I find that in politics, that is frequently the case. Perhaps not equal, but definitely an opposite reaction. And I'm interested, and this is my question, whether you perceive, because you were talking about how you always have to fight for freedom, you can't take it for granted, whether you would consider that indeed that law of physics could equally apply to political science. Thank you.
There were further two questions in the back, please. You were next.
Yeah. Yes, my name is Peter Schröder from UCL, and I'm also Vertrauensdozent of the Naumann Stiftung. My question goes back, well, partly related perhaps to what has just been said, and that is the question of liberty, of liberalism. I mean, those people who are arguing the populist case, they don't necessarily, you know, in the argument at least, do it against liberty. They have just a different notion of it. So the crucial question, it seems to me, to be, you know, to be in charge of what that actually means. And my question to you would be, how can you make this argument towards them in saying, well, you're talking about this, but this is not liberty, this is still authoritarian. But they do it in the sense of, you know, if you look at Brexit, sovereignty and all these things you mentioned. So it seems to me important to not be only vigilant, but be really in charge of the argument.
Yes, my name is Howard Sereda. I'm a member of the National Liberal Club. And from a historical perspective, it seems to me the issue for Europe, as it has been over the past 150 years, is Germany. It's ultimately a matter of Germany. It's ultimately a matter of the decisions that German leaders and the German population make. So the question really arises, can we count on the Germans ultimately to recognize the importance of these values you extol? Are they willing to stand to make the changes which have been necessitated by recent geopolitical events and recognize that they can no longer live permanently under the American military umbrella?
Thank you. Please, the three questions, then we have a last round with a little bit over time, we make it.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions, these. By the way, the other person who's just down the road who I thought you might be referring to is John Stuart Mill. Very few people know, he's just down there. For me, the mistake that much contemporary political science make is to think the laws of politics are like the laws of physics. They're not. Politics is a very different business and much less predictable. And so there's no action with equal and opposite reaction, right? Sometimes there's a big reaction, sometimes there's a small reaction, but normally there's a reaction. And so I've always felt the word reactionary was actually a very useful one, taken quite literally. So if you look at Poland, for example, and the Law and Justice Party, in my view, people say, oh, this is the old Polish political culture. In my view, a lot of that was precisely reactionary. You had this revolutionary liberalization, democratization, modernization, Europeanization, everything changed. And a rather traditional society reacted against it. So there's a lot of truth in it, but not a law of physics. Okay, on populism, you're absolutely right. They very often say we're for liberty, but against liberalism. Right? They also, by the way, say we're for democracy against liberalism. We speak for the people against these liberal elites. So for me, the lesson in that is to keep reminding people that liberty is the core value of liberalism. Friedrich Naumann Stiftung für die Freiheit. Exactly so. And that is something that got rather lost, at least in the way liberalism was communicated in the last 30 years. Germany, this is, I think, what we call ein abendfüllendes Thema, a subject to fill a whole evening. Brief commercial, I have just written a large essay for the New York Review of Books on Germany as we approach the 75th anniversary of the Federal Republic of Germany, yes. 23rd of May, notable anniversary. So the longer answer to your question is contained in that essay, which will be online on May the 2nd. The short version is this. I have no doubt that most Germans, almost all Germans, are deeply attached to these values at home. The question is the level of commitment to supporting them abroad, right? That's the question on the table. And one of the points I make in this essay is that in those 35 years, Germany has had three great moments of strategic choice. Konrad Adenauer's Westbindung, binding West Germany into the Euro-Atlantic West. Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, on which I once wrote a damn thick square book, but it was, as was hinted at, a major initiative. And Helmut Kohl's decision to bind German unification into European unification. And in each of these three moments, three things came together. A notable leader, an international setting, and a domestic debate. And I would say that at the moment we have the international setting, which absolutely calls for such an adjustment. We very much have a domestic debate, very lively domestic debate. So we're waiting for the leader.
Thanks very much. So this is the opportunity for me to say thanks to our Ambassador Berger that he's with us tonight. Now, the final round, we have another 5 minutes with overtime already. So Henrik and Phil and the gentleman in the back.
Yes, Henrik Mortensen, Vice President of Liberal International, and I'm from Denmark. First of all, thank you very much for reminding us that freedom is not a given thing, but something we should fight for all the time. And isn't it wonderful that there's a Ukrainian word for this? And secondly, for reminding us about the Isaiah-Berlinian necessary distinction and inclusion of positive and negative freedom for liberals such as us. These are two very basic things we should never lose sight of. Of course, to us as liberals, freedom is essential. But can we be certain that freedom is important and a value to all human beings? I mean, could it or will it have the same meaning to the Chinese population and the Chinese citizen as it has to liberal Europeans? Or can we imagine that China and other major countries can last without admitting freedom to the citizens?
Thank you. Phil, you pass on the microphone.
Thank you. Phil Benyon, another former member of the European Parliament, also a Vice President of Liberal International alongside Henrik. Part of of what we need to be doing better, I think, for this fight for liberal values and also for European values is messaging, or propaganda, as we might call it. It seems that we're losing the propaganda war in Africa in a big way. And I know from Julie Benoves, another vice president, oh no, he's a former president, he's a president of honor, that we seem to be losing it in Central and South America as well. What can we do and what can Europe do, and I mean Britain as part of that, to improve its messaging, improve its propaganda, to compete with what we are seeing from China, with TikTok and its in its use of propaganda through those channels, and also particularly Russia Today, which permeates pretty well all of the messaging going around Africa.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the lecture, Professor. My name is Martin Sirmai. I'm from the Hungarian Liberal Party Momentum. My question is that in your lecture, you have explored the idea, among many other topics, of these illusions having led us astray, these big moments where we thought that this time it would be different, like building democracy in Iraq, how an empire might not strike back, etc. And my question would be, what similar illusions do you see today that may lead us astray again? And what is, especially if it's possible to replicate this bias, what is your process for identifying these illusions in our thinking today?
Goodness me, what a demanding set of questions. Right. So, I mean, let me work backwards through those. The famous saying, of course, is that history is, life is lived forwards and understood backwards. So the historian's process of identifying the illusions is to wait a little time and see what happened, in a sense, and that's our privilege. But I think I think we have swung from too much optimism to too much pessimism. I think, you know, one of the illusions may be a lack of belief in ourselves. So one of the other things we found in this survey, which was done in 10 major non-European countries, China, India, Turkey, Russia, US, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Indonesia, Brazil, I mean, it was a very, very large survey, was that while these countries quite liked having good relations with Russia, despite the war in Ukraine, when you ask the question, where would you like to live? It was the US or Europe. Of course. And then actually, even when you ask the question, whose standards on human rights do you prefer? It was the West. Whose standards of internet regulation would you prefer? The West. So we have this enormous soft power, which consists in the attractiveness of our own way of life. And I think we shouldn't succumb to too much self-doubt about that, because part of volia is precisely the self-belief in freedom. Now, in relations to, and I'm so glad you didn't use the phrase global south, because I think that the first thing we should do if we really want to win over the global south is to stop talking about the global south and talk about individual countries. I mean, there's a lot to be said in answer to this, but time presses. So I would say, preach less, listen more, right? I mean, the EU in particular, but we as Europeans are terrific preachers. We've gone around the world for decades lecturing people about democracy and the rule of law and, you know, human rights and all of that, the above. And this really gets up people's noses, partly because they do remember the colonial past where we weren't particularly so keen on these values. And now, of course, they say, what about Gaza? Yeah, they say double standards. What are you talking about? So listen more, try to understand how Indians or Chinese or South Africans or Brazilians see their own country, their own culture, their own place in the world, and then build a conversation on the basis of that. And the challenge to us is this: they're all absolutely up for a purely transactional, interest-based conversation. That's quite how they'd like to carry on, right? We'll deal with Russia on this and China on that and you on this, right? But we as Europeans, and particularly those of us who believe in the project of the European Union, have to talk about values too. And how we strike that balance between interest and values is now becoming even more difficult. Finally, universalism, great place to end. How long do we have? Universalism in 2 minutes. There are two versions of universalism, broadly speaking, normative and descriptive, right? So if the question is, in societies and cultures as currently constituted in their self-understanding, does the value of freedom have the same salience as it does in our own? The answer is probably not, certainly not in the official culture. of China or Russia. I mean, the thought is definitely still there, but not the same salience. But what we're talking about is a normative universalism. That is to say, we believe that if you were free, individually and collectively, you would live better, more fulfilled, more dignified lives. This is the proposition that we make to you. And in that sense, I think we should absolutely remain universalist. It connects to the point about self-confidence. This is our proposition to other people. And honestly, you know, there are millions and millions of people in these societies who privately actually believe this, including many millions who have studied with us and live in the West and share our values. So I don't think that we should resign from a confident, proud universalism about liberty, about the value of liberty in that normative sense.
Well, I'm very thankful for your contributions, and I'm very thankful for the positive, upbeat note that you had in your last three answers, especially with respect to the universal values, especially with respect to the soft power, which I think is massively underestimated, and also with respect to warning us against preaching, educational preaching, which is a special characteristic of Germans in particular. We love to preach the world, and we shouldn't. I think I was tempted to say the rest of the world, which is of course not the right way of putting it, but those who have to convinced of these universal values and who share them deep in their heart, but who have their absolutely legitimate interests in a world, in shaping a new liberal world. We should not preach to them, but we should cooperate with them and we should motivate them. Now, we went in some overtime, and the German liberals at the moment, in the present political discussion, have proposed that overtime should be taxed lower than normal time. And now, after this kind of intellectual overtime, I know why. Thanks very much. I found it was an extremely dense and inspiring discussion, and it was a wonderful lecture at the beginning. Thanks very much, Timothy, for being here in this Gladstonian ambiente. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.